Chiyo, the camp's under attack. Everything's in chaos. Chiyo, who had just stepped into the command hall, asked calmly, "Which direction are they attacking from? How many?" The guard hesitated. "It looks like from the sky." If this weren't an emergency, Chiyo thought, she would have loved to give that guard a taste of falling from the sky. But there was no time for scolding. She shoved past him and burst out of the command center. She froze. Throughout the camp, a swarm of black-clad figures fought the village's shinobi. Each one's eyes glowed an eerie green, the color stark against the night. Then one was cut down, and its body flashed green and detonated in a bloated, terrifying explosion. They weren't living enemies. They were puppets. Green eyes, a green flare upon death, and an explosion. This matched the intelligence Kitsuchi had brought in from Iwagakure. Some of the puppets didn't even wait to be struck. They hurled themselves into buildings and crowds and detonated on impact. Suicidal attackers. Chiyo's face went white with rage. The craters and the scattered, severed limbs made her stomach twist. How could her own camp, her people, be hit like this? Then it clicked. Puppets can be stored in sealing scrolls. You don't risk the machines that way. Just have someone fly high and drop the scrolls. Of course they'd come from the sky. She had been too quick to blame the guard. But there was no time for apologies. "Listen up," Chiyo yelled, voice cutting through the screams and the din. "These attackers are all puppets. They don't fear death and will explode when destroyed. Puppet masters, deploy your puppets and intercept them. Use them as shields. Against ordinary shinobi, those puppets would have been a nightmare." There was no perfect answer, but Chiyo improvised. Have their own puppets soak the attacks and minimize human casualties. It was a dangerous tactic, but the only immediate option. What Chiyo couldn't know yet was how much worse it could get. Hyuga Jingi's puppets were designed to detonate and drag whatever was nearby into the blast, whether that nearby thing was flesh or another puppet. Where sand puppets were painstakingly crafted and valuable, Jingi's models were cheap and expendable. Sand puppet masters stared aghast as the green-eyed machines kept exploding in waves. "Are these even puppets?" they muttered. "Who's controlling them? There are no chakra threads." Their whole understanding of puppetry felt shaken. At first, Chiyo's orders steadied the front of the camp, but through a puppet's visual feed, Jingi saw Chiyo organizing the defense and deliberately smiled. If you think you can stabilize this, he thought, then let them serve as bait. At his command, the remaining puppets scattered. Instead of charging in focused waves against the sand forces where Chiyo hoped to funnel them, they fanned out across the camp, crashing into tents, supply carts, and clusters of people, and detonating. Buildings, soldiers, and other puppets alike were pulled into the blasts. The explosions multiplied. "This is bad." Chiyo's voice lost some of its steel as she watched the attackers disperse like a contaminated swarm. Her plan had relied on enemy puppets locking onto sand puppets and fighting in predictable lines. These didn't cling to a fight. They suicide-bombed indiscriminately. With every direction turned into a target, there was no center to hold. Boom, boom, boom. Aftershocks and fire lit the sky as one explosion after another ripped the camp apart. Screams, shouts, and the wail of injured men filled the night. The rear of the camp was a roaring mess. Flames, craters, and scattered bodies. The frontline shinobi, seeing the rear in flames, were stunned. Had an enemy slipped past them? Had the line broken? With time and communication scarce, panic spread at both ends. The defenders were torn between holding the front and rescuing the rear. From the Konoha side, Jingi opened his eyes and turned to Orochimaru, who waited with his masks of composure. "My mission is complete. It's up to you now," he said. "I will not disappoint you, Jingi-kun," Orochimaru replied, a confident smile curving his lips. Their plan had worked. The sand camp lay battered by the self-destructing puppets, countless casualties, and shattered morale. The frontline soldiers could see the devastation behind them and assume the worst. In the ensuing confusion, coordination collapsed. "Fire the attack signal flare," Orochimaru ordered. "Yes, Lord Orochimaru." The command was relayed through the ranks, and the flare arced into the night. On the Konoha side, the prepped squad surged forward upon seeing the signal, shouting as they advanced, "Sand camp under attack." That short, brutal announcement did more than inform. It shattered whatever resolve remained among the sand forces. Their rear was already aflame and disorganized. Chiyo, for all her efforts, could not bring the situation under control. Jingi's 300 self-destructing puppets had not merely inflicted casualties, they had demonstrated a new, terrible tactic to the shinobi world. War could be fought from above, with machines that carried death in their bellies. As Konoha's forces closed in, the lesson was written in fire and bodies. Battles could be engineered to destroy morale, not just lines. Chiyo stood amid the smoke and ruin, fury and helplessness warring in her chest, while the enemy's plan moved to its next stage. The fear these puppets inspired would not stay confined to the battlefield for long. Their sudden appearance proved they could be produced in numbers, mass-produced, so a single village overrun by them would become a catastrophe. High firepower was bad enough. Worse still was the fact that many of Jingi's puppets could and would self-detonate. Jingi didn't linger to watch the sand village camp burn. The puppets had finished their job. The camp was scarred and torn, bodies and wreckage strewn through the streets. Kill! The machines had howled as they tore through the defenders. The sand front was already shrinking under pressure. Inside the command center, Orochimaru was unusually animated, barking orders and coordinating the attack. Jingi stifled a yawn and stretched. "I'm going back," she said. "Once the offensive starts, the medical department will be flooded with the wounded. I need to supervise." A full-scale offensive dragged the whole camp inward. No corner of the operation could be ignored, least of all the hospitals. Injured would be sent back in waves, and Jingi could not allow the medical corps to collapse. The command center could be left in Orochimaru's hands, if, that is, he was capable. If they failed now, under such favorable circumstances, then perhaps he shouldn't remain in charge of the camp. Someone else could take the post. Then the new dispatch arrived. "Lady Chiyo, news from the front. Konoha has launched a major offensive. Multiple strongholds have been attacked. They report our camp has been raided." When Chiyo heard it, her face tightened. The news was bitter and immediate. The camp had been hit in the rear while the front was pressured, an operation designed to split and demoralize them. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. "Send word," she ordered. "Tell the shinobi at the front to start a phased withdrawal to the rear." It was not an order she wanted to give. But with the camp in tatters, morale broken, and supplies scattered, the safest course was to preserve the village's remaining strength, not throw it away in a doomed stand. "Compile casualty lists at once," she continued. "Gather all usable supplies and prepare to retreat into the land of wind." Konoha's raid and the simultaneous strike on the front were not designed merely to chip away at positions. They were meant to drive the sand forces out of the land of rivers and back toward their homeland. If Chiyo had stubbornly held ground and burned through Sand's dwindling resources, they might gain time, but only at the price of annihilation. The two possible outcomes of a last stand were obvious: miraculously hold and gain a breathing space, or be smashed before they could withdraw and lose everything. She chose preservation. More than men and materials, the sand had lost confidence. The horror of self-detonating puppets had shattered many fighters' courage. Bodies could be replaced, supplies consolidated, but fractured morale was slow to mend. A force that had lost its will to fight would turn and run rather than stand, so the only realistic option was orderly retreat. Chiyo knew Konoha would pursue, relentlessly to a point, but would not aim for total annihilation. Their objective was expulsion from river territory, not the complete destruction of sand. The camp erupted into motion. Uninjured shinobi packed fast and prepared to fall back. Medics and courtmen worked through the wounded. Teams gathered what remained of the dead. There was no time to match names with severed limbs or to grant each fallen a proper farewell. At such moments, efficiency outranked ceremony. Across their lines, in Konoha's command tent, Orochimaru sat with a map spread before him, monitoring the withdrawal. "Our goal is to drive the enemy from the land of rivers and push them into the land of wind," he told his officers. "We may pursue, but we will not chase them to the point of needless slaughter. It's not worth it." He knew how some commanders let bloodlust carry them past reason. He kept repeating his orders until every unit had received them and understood the limits. Once the sand were out of rivers, the mission would be complete. The sand retreat was swift and ruthless. Supplies that could not be carried were destroyed, set aflame, or detonated, rather than left to the enemy. The wounded were carried as far as they could be. How many would not survive the arduous fall back to the wind was an ugly question no one wanted to face. Konoha could claim a decisive victory on the field, but it came with unwanted consequences. A flood of prisoners and injured had overwhelmed the medical department, filling it to near capacity. Jingi, who had once found her days slow, was suddenly swamped with work. Orochimaru's workload had ballooned as well. The two commanders who had orchestrated the success found themselves at the center of a new mess, treating the casualties, triaging the captured, and stabilizing the gains. And one of the immediate problems landing on Orochimaru's desk was logistical: the camp's location. The current camp sat too close to the Konoha border and the land of rivers. With the sand pushed back, the forward command needed to be repositioned to keep lines of communication tight and to maintain continuous command in the field. The camp would have to move forward, closer to the new front, so that timely orders could still be issued and the newly won ground could be held. If the camp stayed where it was, frontline intelligence would be slow to reach the village, and news from the village wouldn't get back to the front in time. That delay wasn't just inconvenient, it could cause a cascade of problems. The solution was obvious: push the camp forward. In theory, it sounded simple. In practice, it was difficult. Even if Tsunagakure couldn't immediately counterattack into the land of rivers, building a new camp would take time, and every department would have to move and re-establish itself. The task fell to Orochimaru. After the major battle, the ever-busy Orochimaru still made time to publicize the victory, reporting to the village and informing the daimyo's residents. Tsunagakure was no different. Defeated, Chiyo still had to contact the third Kazekage. Whether the daimyo's residence was notified depended on the third Kazekage's decision. On the border of the land of bears, the third Kazekage, who had been hot on the enemy's heels and was about to cross into that country, stood stunned. The sealing scroll didn't bear the village's encryption code. The handwriting didn't match Chiyo's. The seal was missing. The third Kazekage suspected a smokescreen, a deliberate attempt to throw him off. Defeated, the village had lost so carelessly? Had Chiyo been incompetent, or had the enemy been overwhelming? After a 2-year deadlock with Konoha, how could a sudden rout be acceptable? He wanted to press the pursuit and crush the two Konoha elders who were fleeing along the land of bears border. But the alarming news forced him to halt and abandon the pursuit. Retreat! Those two words, and the third Kazekage stamped on his iron sand and shot into the sky. He needed to get back and face Chiyo in person. He could accept defeat in principle if there was a clear explanation, but he refused to rely on a suspicious scroll. He wanted to see her, to hear the report with his own ears. The fleeing elders, Utatane Koharu and Homura Midokado, noticed the sudden stop of their pursuers and froze. Disheveled and exhausted, Koharu asked, "Should we send someone to check?" "What are we going to investigate now?" Homura snapped. "The enemies aren't chasing us anymore. We get out of this cursed place and head back to the village now." Homura had lost his usual patience. Koharu's suggestion to investigate enraged him. She had been the one who dragged them into this mess. Since leaving the village, it had been her chatter and impulsiveness that had led to their suffering. He still bore the marks of the battle. Half his face was a bloody ruin from a poisoned wound that hadn't been treated in time. If it had been his own mistake, he might have forgiven it. Instead, he had been injured saving Koharu. Resentment hardened into anger. The indulgence he had once shown her evaporated. "Homura, I'm sorry," Koharu murmured, guilt evident as she looked at his ruined cheek. "Enough," he cut her off. "I don't want to hear it." Her voice faltered under his fury. He had no intention of coddling her any longer. "Since the enemies pulled back, gather everyone. Leave a small team to cover our tracks. The rest of you move to the land of fire at top speed." "We're going home," she whispered. "Yes," the others echoed, glancing briefly at the dazed Koharu before obeying. None of them wanted to die out there. They wanted to return to the village. Homura, who had once instinctively protected Koharu, now wished to be as far from her as possible. If associating with people who acted without thought meant risking death, he decided he would keep his distance. Friendship and camaraderie be damned. At the Sand Village camp, Orochimaru and Jingi took in the ruined grounds. Sunagakure was thorough, Jingi said, looking at the flattened remains of streets and buildings. They even tore down most of the residential structures. That removes any advantage for us. Orochimaru regarded the scene with a half smile. They were thorough, but not entirely by their own hands. Jingi blinked. What do you mean? Most of the damage came from the self-destruction of our puppets, Orochimaru said. Chiyo didn't demolish the camp as much as our counterattack did. Look at the craters and collapsed foundations. Those are the marks of puppet explosions. If those attacks hadn't happened, do you think Chiyo would have withdrawn? Jingi bristled at the implication and snapped back, but the truth of Orochimaru's observation hung in the devastated air. The ruined camp made an inconvenient but suitable site for a new base. The torn buildings could be rebuilt. For now, the immediate problem was rebuilding logistics and moving the village forward, and answering the bigger questions about how the battle had gone so wrong. Konoha's attack had been so devastating to the Sand Village camp that Chiyo had no choice but to order a retreat. If the assault hadn't inflicted such heavy losses and put the forward camp under direct pressure, she would have held her ground. Orochimaru only smiled. Jingi's strike had been decisive. If driving the Sand Village all the way back to the Land of Wind had been easy, this war would not have dragged on for nearly a year. If Orochimaru hadn't been audacious enough to convince Hyuga Jingi to launch that raid, who knew how much longer the conflict would have lasted? Everyone in the camp scurried to move the wounded and salvage what they could. Jingi and Orochimaru, by contrast, moved more slowly. After treating a batch of injured soldiers, Jingi slipped back into a state of comparative leisure. From somewhere on the line, someone shouted, "Hold!" Orochimaru had never believed the Sand Village could be toppled in a single blow. The fighting would now grind down into localized skirmishes, each side wearing the other out. The Land of Wind was vast and brutal. In that environment, the war inevitably became a contest of ninja and supplies, a war of attrition. Whichever side had more resources would last longer. Orochimaru, cool and composed after the victory, agreed. "A sound assessment," he said. "We found a stock of puppet parts and materials in the warehouse," Orochimaru added. "Do you want them?" "No, I can't be bothered with those," Jingi replied. He could have taken the lot as spoils, but old sand materials were of little use to him. Whatever the Sand Village had left behind that they hadn't destroyed was probably worthless compared to the new materials he used to build his puppets. It would be quicker and simpler to work with his own supplies. Elsewhere, a temporary camp that had once served as a sand supply depot had been pressed into service for the survivors. The third Kazekage rode in at high speed, and seeing the hollowed expressions of his shinobi, felt the weight of the defeat settle in his gut. The blow to morale was severe. In the command tent, he sat in the main seat and said coldly, "Chiyo, explain." "Kazekage-sama," Chiyo answered without hesitation. "The change in the situation caught us off guard. The responsibility for this defeat is mine." She didn't hedge. Admitting failure calmed the Kazekage's expression slightly. "Tell me exactly what happened." "The sealing scrolls don't record enough detail," Chiyo said. "I'll explain everything I can." She bowed and began. Konoha's attack was deliberate. The mastermind was Konoha's godslayer, Hyuga Jingi. He used specialized puppets delivered in sealing scrolls dropped from the sky. Our sensory teams did detect things falling, but the puppets struck so fast there was no time to react. The strike hit between 3 and 4 in the morning, the deepest sleep of the night. The Kazekage's voice sharpened. A puppet assault shouldn't have destroyed the camp so thoroughly. They would not on their own. The problem was that these puppets self-destructed, and their explosions were far more powerful than the usual exploding tags, Chiyo said. They detonated on contact with people and with structures. Even a single tent was enough to trigger one. Many shinobi were blown apart immediately after they were roused. She almost spat the words out. The image of bodies torn apart in the dark made the third Kazekage frown. He finally understood that Chiyo's failure was not a matter of incompetence. Anyone faced with such a tactic would have been hard-pressed to respond. Even he, with magnet release at his command, would only have reduced losses, not prevented them entirely. The worst part was the delivery method, airdrops. If the assault had been frontal or ground-based, the camp could have used terrain and barriers to keep the suicidal puppets out. Dropping them from the sky removed that option. He cursed under his breath. That damn cunning, insidious. We don't know how many such puppets Jingji has, Chiyo continued. Even knowing this method, we lack a reliable counter. How do you stop sealing scrolls falling from the air? How many of those puppets could we intercept before they hit the ground? Once they land, the damage is inevitable. The Kazakage considered the problem. If he personally oversaw the camp's defense, magnet release could be used to mitigate the airdrops and contain the self-destructing puppets. It was the best defensive measure available. Chiyo, he said, return to the village. Your presence there is sorely needed to steady things. I will take command of the forward camp. Chiyo did not argue. She accepted the decision with the composed professionalism that had marked her on the battlefield. Most commanders would have protested or tried to excuse themselves, but she owned the defeat, analyzed it, and bowed to whatever came next. Very well, she replied. After handing over the camp, Chiyo left immediately for the Sand Village. In the coming days, she would be responsible for reorganizing personnel and supplies, doing the logistical work that would decide whether the sand could hold on through the attrition to come. The supply and troop shortages that ought to have worried the third Kazakage had instead fallen to Chiyo to manage. The war had to be fought, of course, but the village's missions and commissions still had to go on. Those contracts were a major source of income. Neither the Sand Village nor Konoha would willingly put them on hold. He wasn't imagining things. The pressure was real. Compared with the raging third Kazakage, the third Hokage felt oddly dreamlike. He fretted over strategy and logistics, then a victory report arrived at the village. After opening the sealed report on his desk and scanning it carefully, he allowed himself a small, stunned smile. Orochimaru did well, he murmured. Jingi is the key. Tsunade snapped. Tsunade's outburst cut into him. He tried to protest with a cough. Tsunade, I didn't. Don't try to deny it now. She leaned forward, hands on her knees. I won't harp on what happened last time, but let me be clear. If anyone in this village tries to bury Jingi's accomplishments or steal his credit this time, don't blame me if I have to make a scene. The third Hokage forced a smile. He was glad for the victory, but he truly didn't want Jingi showered with too many honors. Last time, they had been able to suppress things. This time, they could not. The daimyo himself had already received the news and was pleased. If the village tried to deny rewards now, it would not only infuriate Tsunade, it would offend their liege. With a resigned sigh, the old man let the matter drop. There was no advantage in a fight over it. Tsunade relaxed back onto the sofa, legs up, arms folded. Now that the enemy's been pushed back into the land of wind, the full-scale conflict is turning localized. We can pull a number of shinobi back from the front and put them to work clearing the backlog of missions and commissions. That should cheer you up. The third Hokage did try to be cheered. It still depends on the foundations of our two villages. Whoever can last longer will win. Localized fighting needs fewer troops, so some recall was inevitable. There were stacks of missions piling up in the village. The recalled ninja could be put to work right away. Konoha could even spare more bodies, but neither he nor Tsunade were willing to divert clan shinobi to that work. Those contracts were meant for the commoner ninja. They were numerous, had weaker social safety nets, and depended on the village for income. If clan families took those jobs, the commoners' lives would become even harder. Tsunade, he asked cautiously, do you think the same kind of attack could work a second time? Tsunade's brow darkened. What do you mean? Could we repeat the raid? He pressed. Since it was so effective before. Don't even think about Jingi, she cut in. We all paid for the last time. Your scheming cost us dearly. If you have any sense of decency left, don't go pawing at his puppets again. He hurried to explain, seeing her flare up. No, not that. We're drained, men, supplies, everything. If we could use this chance to end the war outright. Tsunade frowned, thinking it through. You mean strike at the Sand Village directly? Force them to surrender? Not for a resource war, he said. Not to dig at foundations or to starve them out. If we can mount a decisive offensive while their morale is low, deliver a blow that breaks their will to continue, the war could be over. It would save us from years of attrition. Tsunade considered the possibility. I don't know how many puppets Jingi has left, or whether a surprise strike could deliver a fatal blow. I'll ask him. Tell him this. If he can pull it off, I and the council will relinquish any claim on his work. The village will replace any puppet materials he spends, double compensation. The third Hokage's voice was firm. Promise the materials, compensate for losses, a clean deal in exchange for an end to the war. Tsunade's eyes softened a fraction, but she retained her caution. I won't make that promise for you. I won't force Jingi into anything for our sake. I'll speak to him and present the offer, but the choice is his. He had hoped she would guarantee it, to smooth Jingi's acceptance. Instead, she would only inquire, leaving the outcome to the puppet master himself. The old man felt disappointment, but he could not blame her. Forcing Jingi would destroy any chance of cooperation. Before they could pursue the matter further, a shinobi from intelligence burst into the room, a sealed scroll clutched in his hands. Hokage-sama, Lady Tsunade, this just arrived. It's fresh intelligence from the Rain Country border camp. Tsunade rose and took the scroll. The third Hokage braced himself and watched her read, silently praying the news would not be worse than what they already endured. There were enough troubles in the village as it was. Tsunade opened the sealed intelligence scroll, and her face changed the instant her eyes scanned it. No reinforcements? That couldn't be right. Could Orochimaru have ignored a direct order? Was Jinji involved? She hoped not. If Jinji had a hand in this, it would be catastrophic. Open defiance could perhaps be explained away, but abandoning the two elders in the field, leaving them wounded and maimed, was an offense of a different order. Tsunade flung the scroll across the table at the third Hokage, and without hesitation, drew the small puppet she used to contact Jingi. The third Hokage, numbed by the image on the paper, caught the scroll with shaking fingers. He forced himself to read. After only a few lines, his face went even paler than Tsunade's. He slammed the scroll down so hard the table jumped. How dare he? He roared. Orochimaru had defied an order? Why would he? Didn't he understand that refusing to send aid could doom the elders? The third Hokage's mind raced. Had someone, Jingi, interfered? He looked up at Tsunade. She, too, looked grim. Without a word, she set the puppet on the table and activated it. The puppet's glassy eyes glowed, and both of them held their breath while a faint thread of connection reached across the miles. The third Hokage wanted to unload his accusations, but he held back, silently urging Tsunade to ask the questions. She met his look and spoke straight into the channel. Jingi, are you aware that Orochimaru ignored the Hokage's order and didn't send reinforcements? Across the distance, in a hastily prepared room at the camp, Jingi, caught resting, stretched and answered lazily when the puppet lit up. It's not my doing. I only heard about it after the fact. Orochimaru wouldn't spare the manpower. He thought rescuing those old men wasn't worth the cost. He's angling for a decisive victory to change the situation for the village. The third Hokage's jaw tightened. Unimportant? Tsunade exhaled, relieved. At least Jingi wasn't involved in colluding with Orochimaru. If he had been, the offense would have been monstrous and personal, something Jingi wouldn't hide so clumsily. Her relief eased the hard knot of suspicion she'd felt. What's the situation at the camp now? She asked. Jingi's tone turned practical. Everyone's busy. The old camp's been converted into a supply transfer point. The new camp is set up at a position we took from the sand. Good ground. Orochimaru chose it. The medical department's stretched thin, too many wounded. If you're in the village, try to push them supplies. Don't let the Hokage cut us off, Jingi added with a touch of bitterness through the puppet. He'd do anything to pin things on me. Tsunade shot the third Hokage a look. He went a peculiar shade of red. That's slander, he muttered, voice tight. I would never. Have the elders returned? Did they finish their mission? Jingi asked, his voice suddenly sharp. They haven't returned, Tsunade said. They made it into Fire Country territory and are resting at the Rain border camp, but both are severely wounded. One's disfigured, the other lost a hand. Silence from the puppet. If it's nothing to do with me, I won't bother you. There's a lot to do here. Jingi sounded bored but curt. Take care of it on your end. Tsunade put the puppet away. She didn't want Jingi to say anything else that might inflame the third Hokage. Turning to the old man who had been her teacher and now her superior, she stated firmly, "I contacted Jingi in front of you. He's not involved. This was Orochimaru's doing." "I heard him," the third Hokage said, though his expression showed he still felt unsettled. Suspicions had been raised against Jingi before. They were difficult to dismiss outright, but suspicion wasn't proof. Jingi had no reason to sabotage the village right now, and making such a bold move would only isolate him. That left Orochimaru. "Tsunade," he said, voice low, "I worry people will latch on to Jingi's name because of past enmities. We need to handle this carefully." She nodded. "The daimyo will be handing out rewards soon for the recent actions. Jingi and Sakumo Hatake are set to be honored. The daimyo thinks highly of them, especially Jingi. Try to keep things calm so personal grudges don't turn into a civil war in Konoha." The third Hokage's frown deepened. The daimyo's favor might complicate matters. Jingi already had significant influence because of his contributions and Tsunade's connection to him. No reason to inflame tensions over an already tense war. "I will," he said at last. "There's too much at stake to have us tearing ourselves apart." He stood, pacing once as he thought. Then, quieter, he added, "I'm going to the Rain border camp to see Koharu and Homura myself. I need to know the full extent of their injuries. While I'm gone, I want you to preside over the Hokage's office, handle official duties for a few days." Tsunade, who had been preparing to leave, froze. She stared at him, stunned by the request. "No, you came all the way here for this? Isn't he fine? He's hurt, yes, but ninjas get hurt on missions all the time. Who can promise they won't be? Even Tsunade, a medical nin, can't." Tsunade didn't expect the third Hokage to be so anxious that he'd personally make the trip. He simply looked at her and said, "Tsunade." The third Hokage's eyes were pleading. Tsunade felt numb, a shiver running down her spine. She waved her hand awkwardly. "All right, Hiruzen, don't look at me like that. It's uncomfortable. If you want to go, go. I'll come to the Hokage office tomorrow and handle official duties while you're gone. Happy?" Hiruzen knew Tsunade's tendency to slack off. If he hadn't pushed, she wouldn't have agreed. Even if she sat in the office, she would only take care of major matters and put off the rest, expecting him to sort them when he returned. That wasn't acceptable. He needed the village to run normally while he was away, including the Hokage office. "Fine. Take the Hokage's seal with you. You'll need it for official business." Decisive, he handed her the seal. Tsunade was speechless. She had brought trouble on herself for nothing, but what could she do? The third Hokage insisted on going to the Rain Country border camp. She couldn't abandon the village's affairs. Muttering curses at her own soft-heartedness, Tsunade grudgingly picked up the seal and left. Once Tsunade had departed, the third Hokage made his arrangements. That afternoon, he took the Hokage guard platoon, some medical nin, supplies, and left the village for the frontline camp. He intended to bring help to Homura Mitokado and Utatane Koharu and ask them questions in person. Konoha, however, continued to operate as usual. Many ninjas who arrived at the Hokage office were briefly stunned to see Tsunade on the throne, but they quickly recovered and carried on as if nothing were wrong. Reports were filed, missions assigned, opinions sought. The office didn't descend into chaos because the third Hokage was away. The impact on the village was minimal. It was only Tsunade who suffered. She had to work long hours, and for someone lazy by nature, that was torture. Fortunately, Nara Shikaku managed the Anbu matters, so she only had to inspect the Anbu base occasionally. If she'd had to run the Anbu as well, she would have been in real trouble. In present-day Konoha, whoever sat in the Hokage's chair had to oversee logistics and medical services too. It wasn't an easy job. By the end of the second day, she was exhausted and sleep-deprived. Dragging herself away that night, she almost cried. "Oh, Hiruzen, when will you come back? The village can't do without you. Hurry back." The Anbu squad assigned to guard Tsunade stood baffled. What on earth was their commander muttering? Begging for the Hokage to return? Meanwhile, the third Hokage had already reached the Rain Country border camp and found his two old comrades, Utatane Koharu and Homura Mitokado. When he turned to Homura, he almost didn't recognize him. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it was an insult to his dignity. "Heh," Homura rasped. "To save Koharu, We were taken advantage of. I was injured, and because we didn't get proper care, this is what happened. Homura's resentment toward Koharu hadn't faded after they returned to the Fire Country. If anything, being safe again made his anger worse. He hated Koharu's willfulness and thoughtlessness. Koharu hung her head, ashamed. It's my fault. If I hadn't been so stubborn and prideful, we would have come back sooner. Homura and I wouldn't have been injured. Koharu stared at her bare left palm with regret. The palm had been amputated. Lack of treatment and the harsh conditions in the land of bears meant it had to be sacrificed to save her life. Losing a palm was almost like losing a hand. Hiruzen sighed and asked the question he'd come to ask. Tell me exactly what happened. What did you encounter along the way that led to this? Sealed scroll communications were limited. Not everything could be recorded. Some things had to be explained in person, which was why he had come. What else could we have encountered? Homura snapped. It was our own fault. He laughed bitterly. His smile made the scars on his face look even more grotesque. We slipped into the land of wind without trouble. To trap Hyuga Jingi, Koharu and I decided to split up and bait the enemy into destroying the tougher, more dangerous targets. With no outsiders present, he spoke bluntly. We were trying to trap Hyuga Jingi. Whether they'd succeeded was unclear. At minimum, they'd trapped themselves. We completed our initial objectives and destroyed several targets, but we were eventually discovered. The third Kazekage personally led the pursuit and tried to encircle and annihilate us in the land of wind. Hiruzen nodded. They had kept normal contact as these things happened. But everything changed when we turned toward the land of bears. Homura's eyes flashed like a predator's. Koharu insisted the mission wasn't finished. She was afraid of being mocked by Hyuga Jingi and couldn't swallow her pride. She wanted to drag the third Kazekage into the land of bears, even to open up a third battlefield. At that time, our communications shinobi sacrificed himself to cover us, and we lost reliable contact. And during the stalemate, Koharu was wounded. We made heavy sacrifices to hold the Kazekage back. So we didn't wait for reinforcements, Homura barked. The reinforcements that were supposed to arrive 2 days later ended up making things worse. Hiruzen, you have to explain, Homura demanded. Where were the reinforcements? Homura Mitokado could barely keep his temper in check, and Utatane Koharu's fury was near boiling over. Where are the reinforcements you promised? Koharu demanded. If you hadn't kept telling us there would be reinforcements, 2 more days, we would have pulled out long ago. We wouldn't have suffered so many losses. Because of that, we nearly died in the land of bears. Orochimaru disobeyed orders, the third Hokage said softly. He closed his eyes as if saying it hurt. He wanted to launch a decisive, full-scale offensive. He refused to pull back personnel. Orochimaru, Koharu spat. Homura went still for a few seconds, then stared at the elder with disbelief. They had considered every possibility, but never that Orochimaru, the obedient, calculating Orochimaru, would betray them. One act of disobedience had almost gotten them killed in the land of bears. Why would he do that? Was this his own decision, or did someone push him? Koharu fired off. Who's behind him? The third Hokage opened his eyes and sighed. No one pushed him. It was Orochimaru's own choice. He wanted a victory. He wanted to turn the full-scale war in the land of rivers into a localized conflict in the land of wind. He succeeded. He and Jingi worked together to drive the sand village back into the land of wind. Jingi? Homura asked, anxious and sharp. Is he in their camp? Has his mission been completed? Why would he be with the land of rivers forces? It's done, the third said, and the words landed like a cold stone. He spoke with reluctant honesty, even when the truth stung. After completing his mission, he went to their camp to see Tsunade. Tsunade wanted to return to the village to rest for a while. Jingi went to take over her position. Koharu's mouth went dry. All their careful strategy, splitting forces, creating a path Jingi would take, because it would be easier for the enemy to detect, had been used against them. Jingi's mission succeeded while their detachment was left in disarray. Jingi completed his objective, went to the Land of Rivers camp, and partnered with Orochimaru to win another crucial merit. Meanwhile, many of Koharu and Homura's subordinates had died or been maimed. Reinforcements had been extinguished in the chaos. They returned to the land of fire with the crippled and the wounded. Homura felt his cheeks burn. The humiliation sat like bile. Koharu was incandescent. "Did Hyuga Jingi take part in Orochimaru's refusal to send aid?" she demanded. Both looked to the third for an answer. "No," he said, relief and reluctance wrapped together. "This was Orochimaru alone. Jingi only learned of it afterward. Tsunade and I contacted him ourselves. There was no deception." "Think about it." Homura cut in. Could something like this be hidden? With Jingi's temperament, would he willingly get himself into obvious trouble that would ruin his and Tsunade's names? He wouldn't. Koharu's suspicions hung in the air, but Homura's blunt certainty shut them down. He was sharp, imperious, intimidating, and Koharu's backbone faltered under it. The third Hokage, seeing his old friend's anger burning like a fuse, quietly agreed. "Homura's right," he said. "Although Jingi and we have had conflicts, those conflicts almost always started from our side. Jingi wouldn't deliberately court trouble like this, the kind that would be exposed and damage both his and Tsunade's reputations. So how will you punish Orochimaru?" Koharu snapped. If Jingi had nothing to do with it, then all the wrath should fall on Orochimaru. He had disobeyed orders, refused to send help, and as a result, they had been left to wait and fight for their lives. Koharu wanted to tear him apart. Homura's scarred half of his face twitched. He wanted to strike the woman for the crudeness of her rage, but he kept his voice cold and practical. "You think he can be punished?" he said. "He didn't just refuse aid, he won the outcome the village needed. He turned a full-scale war into a contained one and forced the enemy back into the land of wind." Koharu's outrage curdled into a bitter, wounded question. "So our injuries were for nothing? All we suffered in the land of bears? What was the point if nothing happens to him?" "No matter how you feel, the result stands," Homura said flatly. "He's a hero of the village now. We have to acknowledge that." The third Hokage, who had the burden of leadership etched into his features, added, "If Orochimaru hadn't brought back such a decisive victory, then yes, we could have punished him. But right now, he must be recognized for what he did. I'm sorry." Koharu's hands trembled. "That's not justice," she whispered, furious and hollow. Homura wanted to lash out. He wanted retribution too. But he knew it would be insanity to move against a man who had just secured the village's strategic victory. "Don't be reckless," he told her. "Pushing this now would be foolish." "Homura, I'll give you an explanation for everything," the third Hokage said softly to Koharu, trying to calm the storm. "Not now. We'll do it properly when the situation allows. In the meantime, I brought medical nin and all the supplies from the village. We'll treat your wounds." "Treat? Treat my hand?" Koharu's voice cracked as she held up her bare left hand, fingers damaged, skin marred. Her eyes flashed with grief and fury. "What kind of treatment can bring this back?" Homura Midokado said nothing. Compared with Utatane Koharu, the wounds on his face, once treated, wouldn't leave grotesque deformities. Scars would remain, of course, but it was better than Koharu's current ruined condition. "Hiruzen, I want an explanation," Koharu had shouted before storming off. The third Hokage pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head helplessly. Homura let out a bitter snort. "Koharu's temper keeps getting worse," he said. "To be honest, all of this is her own doing. If she'd managed her temper, none of this would have happened. She caused so many losses before, and it never changes. How many times have we had to clean up her mess, deal with the disasters she creates?" Realizing how crude that sounded, he paused and rephrased. "I used to think Danzo was the most foolish among us. Now I realize it's Koharu." Hiruzen had no answer for that. He offered only a weary smile. "You weren't like this before," he said quietly. "But anger and blame won't change anything now. Focus on your treatment and try to minimize the scarring. As for Koharu, we'll have to find another way to handle her." Hundreds of shinobi in the village had come back from battle maimed. Many of them had miserable lives. Utatane Koharu, however, was not an ordinary ninja. Her status ensured she'd be cared for. Homura's wounds, terrible as they looked, were simpler to treat. If the medical nin controlled the chakra precisely, they could reduce the scarring. The likely outcome was that Homura would end up with half his face disfigured, but that was preferable to Koharu's loss of a hand. Under the third Hokage's orders, several medical nin who were waiting rushed into the wooden house and began treating Homura. He bit back the pain and asked as the procedures began, "Hiruzen, tell me everything about this full-scale attack." Hiruzen thought a moment, nodded, and then carefully explained the whole affair. By the time he finished, Homura's initial treatment was complete and the medics had left. Homura clenched his fist and slammed it down on the table. "Orochimaru must have been angry about being forced onto the battlefield earlier," he snapped. "He must have refused to rescue us and then told Hyuga Jingi about it to curry favor. Then Jingi could vent his anger and use puppets to attack the Sans camp. Both would win a claim, and the village couldn't punish Orochimaru afterward. Perfect. Absolutely perfect." Hiruzen frowned and took another drag of his cigarette. When Homura had let off steam, he spoke softly. "It wasn't just Orochimaru who wanted glory," the third Hokage admitted. "Before we got your message back, Tsunade and I discussed whether we could replicate that attack and use it against the Sand Village. If their rear camp were struck and they suffered heavy losses, the war could be ended quickly." Homura stared at him. "Replicate it?" "Yes." Hiruzen's smile was awkward. "We hadn't contacted Jingi about it yet. When Tsunade reached out before, he was entirely focused on Koharu and you. There wasn't an opportunity to bring up the idea." Homura almost rolled his eyes. If he had a Byakugan, he might have. If Jingi didn't agree, the plan would be impossible. You can't act without his consent. The thought of what might happen if Jingi refused simmered in him as a new worry. At Konoha's new encampment, Hyuga Jingi stood outside a prison cell and watched Ye-Kang pace and bare her teeth like a trapped lion. The scene both irritated and amused him. She'd finally reached her limit. "Did the Sand Village lose the war?" Ye-Kang spat. "Why is Konoha occupying our former camp? Tell me, how long do you plan to keep me locked up? You wanted to sow distrust between me and my comrades. Congratulations, you succeeded." Ye-Kang's anger was sharp and public. The high-quality care she'd been given had begun to make the other captured Sand Shinobi suspicious, and that suspicion was growing. At first, only a few doubted her, still holding out hope. But as days passed and she was compelled, by practical limits, not desire, to accept excellent food and proper medical attention, the seeds of doubt took root. She'd tried to refuse. For 3 days she fasted. The guards delivered the food anyway and left it untouched. But she could not starve herself indefinitely. After 3 days of dizziness, she finally ate 2 rice balls and left the rest alone. No meat, no eggs. She used the restroom the Konoha guards had arranged and washed, because she couldn't perform those personal acts publicly in the cramped cell. Simple, private needs, but visible to the other prisoners. That was all it took. The neighboring captives' grievances grew louder. Some of the more extreme Sand Shinobi openly accused her of betrayal. If she hadn't defected, they said, why would she eat such good food? Why would she use the special restroom arranged by the enemy? The accusations tightened like a noose. Ye-Kang had wanted only to survive, but what should have been compassion or basic necessity had become proof, at least in the prisoner's eyes, of a treachery she had never committed. No one seemed to care whether Ye-Kang would starve or be shamed for taking care of her private needs in front of others. When her companions first questioned her, she could still answer them. At the start, she defended herself fiercely, but as time passed, her arguments grew weaker. No one believed her anymore. Ye-Kang couldn't understand it. "I only eat simple things. Plain rice, rice balls. I don't touch anything fancy. Does that make me a fan of Konoha's gourmet cuisine?" She wanted to say, "I don't want to relieve myself out in the open. Wanting privacy is betrayal now?" When they moved to the new camp, she could no longer sit still. This place had been the Sand Village's camp. Now it was Konoha's. That meant the Sand had been beaten. Konoha had won. Ye-Kang kept asking to see Jingi, the on-duty ninja who had taken her in. He kept delaying, until finally he came to her cell today. The moment they met, she exploded. If not for the seal on her body that stopped her from using ninjutsu, she would have spat a fireball at him. Jingi watched her flail with a faint, amused smile. "Why do you expect me to answer your questions?" he said. "As a prisoner of war, do I have any rights?" she snapped. "Then what do you want? Did we take you prisoner just to play with you?" Ye-Kang felt like she was losing her mind. Could he just spit it out? "I don't have time for games," she said. The smile dropped from Jingi's face. He stepped closer and looked down at her, She was a head shorter than him, and his voice lowered. Leaving the sand and joining us is the only way out for you. Your path back to the village has been cut off. Some of the companions who still believed you were released by me. You know what they'll say when they return to the sand camp. Switching to Konoha is your only hope. So I should thank you? Yi Kong stared at him, stunned, and then looked up and addressed the newcomer who had just arrived with a single word, Orochimaru-sama. The guard nearby bowed as Orochimaru approached. Orochimaru walked up with a smile, peered at Ye Kang, dirty, smelly, hair a tangled mess, and frowned with obvious confusion. Jingi, do you really find her pretty? He asked lightly. Orochimaru wasn't usually interested in women, but he did have an eye for beauty. In his view, Ye Kang couldn't be called pretty. She was disheveled, malnourished, and her long green hair looked like a bird's nest. Her cheekbones stuck out. She looked like skin and bone. The only thing he noticed was that her chest was relatively large. Tsunade, too, had pockets of softness. He couldn't understand why that trait would be attractive in so many people. He snorted. Jingi found Orochimaru's assessment amusing. Ye Kang's anger flared so hot it could have burned the room. Orochimaru, no matter how beautiful someone is, after being locked up for a while and before they get cleaned up, they won't look good anywhere, she snapped. Do you need something from me? Orochimaru nodded once, almost dismissively, and turned to Jingi. A letter came in secretly from the Rain Border Camp, he said. They say 2 of our elders have reached the Rain Border Camp injured, and the 3rd Hokage rushed over. Is that true? Jingi had not told Orochimaru about Tsunade and the 3rd Hokage contacting him. Orochimaru had been busy, and clearly had people who passed him information behind others' backs. Jingi gave him a meaningful look and answered in front of Ye Kang. Yes, Tsunade contacted me a few days ago. She and your teachers suspect I was involved, suspect I disobeyed orders to provide aid. Orochimaru chuckled. Ye Kang in the cell felt dumbfounded. They were discussing this war, this treachery, in front of a prisoner. Was that appropriate? Of course, our Hokage is always interesting, Jingi went on. He even wanted to know whether this kind of attack could be reproduced. He turned to look at Ye Kang. The target would be the Sand Village. If Sand suffers a devastating strike like that, they might be forced to raise the white flag and end the war. Ye Kang's eyes widened. Orochimaru laughed at the thought. It seems the 3rd Hokage's proposal may be refused. From what Jingi said and from what Orochimaru had done, it was clear that Jingi wouldn't agree to such a request easily. The attack on the camp, the one that had captured her, had only happened because Orochimaru had arranged many things to persuade Jingi, otherwise they would have fought in more conventional ways. After saying that, Orochimaru left decisively. Ye Kang glared at Jingi. She wanted to ask a dozen questions, but as he had just said, she was a prisoner. She had no right to know. She could only sulk in her cell and stare. Jingi glanced around the camp as if reminding her of what had happened. Not long ago, there was an attack here, a puppet attack, the same kind of puppets that captured you. A huge number of puppets rained down from the sky and tore through the camp on a dark night. Then they began to self-destruct, doing terrible damage to this place. After that, Grandma Chiyo fled. Ye Kang's heart lurched. The color drained from her face as realization settled in. She had guessed correctly. The Sand had been badly defeated, and their old camp had become Konoha's new camp. And now, Jingi continued in a low, cold voice, our Hokage plans to replicate that attack. This time the target would be the Sand Village. Tell me, after such an attack, can this war continue? His words were like a devil whispering in her ear. If the Sand were forced to retreat inland and the fighting became localized, the pressure of logistics, troops, and dwindling supplies would steadily tip the scales toward Konoha. Even without a second wave, Sand's situation would only get worse. If Konoha launched the second attack, the Sand Village would be hard-pressed to survive. Ye Kang wasn't naive. She could see it all from the fragments of information she had. If the pressure mounted, surrender would become inevitable. And then she remembered something else Jingi had said. He had cut off her return path. Some companions who had believed her had been released by him. If that were true, then in the eyes of her fellow villagers, she had already become a traitor, someone who had defected to Konoha. Leaning weakly against the railing, Yikong looked dazed. She couldn't make sense of why her stubbornness over the last few days had led to this. Nor could she understand why her companions suspected her of betraying the village. Refusing to starve herself or to relieve herself in public, how could that be called betrayal? The reason was laughable, and yet now that it had become reality, who could laugh at something so absurd? After a long, blank pause, Ye Kong raised her head. What kind of treatment will I receive if I transfer to Konoha? No, you're mistaken. It's not Konoha you'll be transferring to. It's to me. Jingi shook a finger at her, correcting her tone with a half-smile. You must pledge allegiance to me first. Only then will you get the treatment you deserve. If your loyalty is to the village, you'll always be branded a traitor. Transferring to another village and pledging allegiance to him were different things, he said. Although villages will take ninja from elsewhere on paper, most transfer cases don't end well. Someone who betrays once may betray again. You win. Ye Kong gave a bitter, helpless smile. She wasn't a traitor, but no one believed her, and the person who had brought her to this point stood right in front of her. The most ridiculous part was that she had to pledge allegiance to him now. Very well. Remember your words. I can accept your allegiance, but I won't tolerate betrayal. Remember who you are. Jingi waved to the sentry standing nearby. Guard. The on-duty ninja hurried over. Jingi instructed him, take her to wash up and change. Feed her. Release the seal, then send her to the medical department. Release it directly? The guard asked, incredulous. Even transferred ninja normally underwent many tests before being trusted. If the seal was lifted now, what if Ye Kong suddenly attacked? Do as I say. Jingi only patted the guard's shoulder before turning away. He had weighed the risk. Once the seal was released, she might try something, but the price of such a move would be her life. Alone Ye Kong couldn't cause real trouble. Yes, the guard didn't understand, but an order was an order. They washed her, changed her into clean clothes, and she ate ravenously. Then came the sealing squad to lift the seal. Watching them, Ye Kang's eyes were full of conflict. Weren't they worried she'd attack and use the chance to run? She studied the camp out of habit, measuring her chances. The security was tight, too tight. Even if she'd struck, the odds of escaping were negligible. Jingi might have other tricks, waiting for her to act. And if she did make a move, her chance to transfer to Konoha would be gone forever. In the Sand Village, she would be branded a traitor. In Konoha, she'd be treated as a traitor as well. The guard who led her remained on edge the whole way, ready for any sudden violence. Ye Kong watched his tension and realized how hopeless any attempt would be. When the seal was lifted, she started scanning the camp even more carefully. It felt like a bad omen. Still, the worst thing didn't happen. She held back and was brought before Jingi. He inspected her, noting how much she had changed, then asked with a cool curiosity, "You had an opportunity to attack and flee just now. Why didn't you?" "The camp's security is too strict," Ye Kang said. "Even if I'd attacked, I wouldn't have escaped. I would have been killed or recaptured. And even if I had escaped, what then? Become a traitor in my companion's eyes?" she added, smiling at herself in self-disgust. Jingi snapped his fingers, then spoke in a tone that pretended to regret something. "Actually, I lied to you before. Your comrades weren't released, so in the eyes of the others, you aren't a traitor, you're just a captive." Ye Kong's breath hitched. "You what?" Her heart sped up. "So if you'd told me differently." "I said that if you had chosen to attack, there would have been a good chance to get away, though also a good chance I'd catch you. But your last chance is gone." Jingi's words were calm and even a little cold. Ye Kong felt a burning fury. He had baited her. Even if escape wasn't guaranteed, he had lied about the circumstances and robbed her of a real shot. She wanted to lash out, to punch him, but the anger only made her feel helpless. She turned her face away stubbornly. Then, without warning, her body jerked and shot toward Jingi. He'd raised his right hand and used gravity and repulsion techniques to suspend her in midair, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Since you didn't choose to attack," he said, "I expect you to stay by my side and keep whatever that is in check. Don't think of anything else, or the consequences will be severe." He lowered her back down casually. "Now go rest in the next room. Recuperate, mentally and physically. I don't need a weakling at my side." Kong's head was buzzing as she stumbled to the adjoining room. What had happened just now? She still couldn't explain how she had flown up. An invisible force had gripped her and made her comply, levitating her toward Jingyi. The power had been terrifying. For some reason, she felt relieved she hadn't acted rashly. Even if the Konoha ninja in the camp hadn't intercepted her, she wouldn't have been able to escape. There had been no real chance. She collapsed on the bed, exhausted and emotionally drained, and fell into a deep sleep. Not long after she slept, Orochimaru arrived, carrying a bundle of fresh ingredients. In the camp, only Jingyi and Orochimaru openly cooked for themselves. Orochimaru, busy and with little free time, generally preferred to bring ingredients rather than cook, while Jingyi's habit of preparing his own meals had become accepted, even expected, by the other ninja. After all, a high-ranking medic and village hero cooking his own simple meals wasn't worth making a fuss over. Orochimaru glanced once at the beef stewing in the pot, then drew a folded letter from his sleeve and laid it on the table. "Who's it from?" Jingyi asked. Orochimaru tapped the paper once with a pale finger and smiled. "The daimyo. The envoy with the rewards is already on its way to Konoha, but after I spoke with him, the daimyo decided his own envoy should come to the camp in person. Openly asking the daimyo for favors, even the third Hokage would have hesitated. Tsunade might, but she probably wouldn't. Relying on a noble's largesse carried a faint sting of embarrassment. Orochimaru's logic, however, was straightforward. The daimyo hates the Sand Village, he said. Under my and Jingyi's leadership, we forced them back into the Land of Wind. That gave him an outlet for his anger. A man like him will want to show gratitude. "So what did you ask for?" Jingyi pressed. Orochimaru's smile didn't change. "Money." Jingyi nearly choked on his own laugh. "Money? No flourish, no symbolic title, just plain cash?" He blinked at Orochimaru, incredulous. The daimyo was hardly poor, but for Orochimaru to request money so plainly was unexpected. Orochimaru met the look and explained dryly, "Between the reward I paid you and the money poured into experiments, I'm broke. I'm not interested in meaningless honors. I asked for money." Jingyi tried to hide his relief. It made sense. Experiments and puppetry ate funds like fire. He had plans that would require far more than a few coins, a puppet army, stocked with new materials in quantity. Cost-cutting could only go so far. He could see the figures in his head and felt the thrill of possibility. Tens of millions of ryo would do. A few 100 million would be ideal. Titles and favors were useless to him. The daimyo's people, the political tangles they brought, were worse than no reward at all. "What about my reward?" Jingyi asked. Orochimaru shrugged. It didn't say. Jingyi snatched up the envelope, tore it open, and read. The letter names the recipients but was vague on details. Jingyi let it drop. There was no point worrying over what the daimyo might offer. As far as Jingyi was concerned, money was the only reward worth wanting, and he was not shy about it. "You shouldn't get involved with the daimyo's people," Jingyi added, more to himself than to Orochimaru. "The village and the daimyo are always trying to empty each other's coffers. Enjoy the money if it's given, but don't get entangled. No one benefits if the daimyo's house grows stronger." Orochimaru chuckled and shook his head. "I'll take the money. I won't be buying allegiances or recruiting his retainers. Give me cash and I'll be happy. Ask me for loyalty and I'll refuse." Jingyi let the subject drop. He'd long since accepted that Orochimaru would not sell himself to a feudal lord, and he agreed. People like the daimyo were best left to hunting, feasts, and pleasures. They were ill-suited to wield real military power. Jingyi gave a light, wistful snort. "Sometimes I envy the daimyo's simple life." Orochimaru looked at him as if he'd grown a second head. "Simple? Think about it," Jingyi said. "Good food, every whim attended to, a whole harem of beautiful women. What's not to envy?" He grinned, then corrected himself. "In my previous life, I might have thought so, but now, I want more. Women who can fight and hold their own are far more interesting than idle courtiers. I have bigger goals." Orochimaru's expression didn't change. He had never cared for the pleasures that preoccupied so many. Experiments, knowledge, progress, those were his indulgences. Titles and mistresses were trifles he could dispense with. "As long as you know what you want," he said. Kong had already resigned herself to reality long before the money talk finished. When Jingyi told her what her role would be, she stared at him stunned. "My job?" Rest and recover for a few days, Jingi said after a pause. Train, grow stronger. After that, be my secretary. She felt her insides turn to ice. The humiliation was clear as a blade, and it only got worse 2 days later when a courier arrived with several fitted secretary outfits. Ye Kang had to peel off the dull, practical ninja uniform she'd been wearing. Admittedly, the suit, a tailored jacket, a narrow skirt, and high heels flattered her far more than the workmanlike gear she'd had. Still, she had not imagined her post-battle reward would be clerical work. The village prepared a formal reception. The daimyo's envoy delegation had reached Konoha, and the third Hokage, just returned to the village, greeted them at the gates. The envoys bore gifts from the daimyo to 3 people, Sakumo Hatake, Jingi, and Orochimaru. When the delegation presented the package destined for Orochimaru, the third Hokage's smile faltered. The gift meant little in status, but a great deal in cash. The daimyo had granted Orochimaru 30 million ryo. The pile of notes gleamed like a small mountain, and the third Hokage's eyes lingered on it with thinly veiled covetousness. It was not his to take. Sakumo Hatake received his portion in the village itself, and after the ceremonies, the delegation would depart for the frontline camp to deliver Jingi's and Orochimaru's rewards in person. The third could only watch. Orochimaru's 30 million made many in the Hokage office murmur with envy, but the sums given to Sakumo and to Jingi, revealed as the envoys read the list, sent the third Hokage's blood pressure spiking in a series of subtle, indignant flares. Some rewards were just money. Others were the kind of favor that could make even a patient old man lose his composure. Sakumo Hatake's reward was no different from the original story, a Hokage t-shirt. The daimyo's gift signaled that he thought highly of Sakumo, that he might be fit to become the next Hokage. Given the ages of Hiruzen Sarutobi and Sakumo, naming a potential successor wasn't unheard of in other villages, but in Konoha, it was another matter. Hiruzen didn't want any obvious Hokage candidates. The appearance of one was a direct threat. In front of the daimyo's envoys, the third Hokage forced himself to hide his displeasure. But when Sakumo accepted the gift with a grin and put the shirt on right then and there, something broke. Tsunade watched Hiruzen's face grow ashen and smacked her forehead. If Sakumo's stunt was bad, Jingi's reward was worse. Sakumo had received only a Hokage t-shirt. Jingi had been given a full Hokage robe, a plain white garment with red trim and no writing, but still a robe that made the third Hokage's temples throb. After sending the envoy delegation to rest, Hiruzen returned to the Hokage office and shut the door behind him. He sat with a pipe between his fingers, the smoke hanging in the room like a fog. "Tsunade," he said flatly, "what do you think the daimyo meant by all this? Is he hinting that I should start naming a successor?" "I don't know," Tsunade snapped, her irritation thinly veiling a headache. "And I'm sick of you bringing it up. If you want to worry, worry about Sakumo. I don't know what he's thinking. As for Jingi, he cares less for robes than for pretty girls." At that, Tsunade looked almost ready to strike something. She'd only just noticed how many women seemed to orbit around Jingi lately. They kept appearing, one after another. There's even someone back at the frontline camp. That genius Ye Kang from the Sand Village brought a woman back with him. I should have seen this coming. Hiruzen blinked in surprise. He likes women? Just like you. Tsunade shot back, and Hiruzen deflected with a chuckle and a cough. "Enough, Tsunade," he said, diffusing the tension. "He's a man. Let him be. As for the clothes, it's a gift from the daimyo. He should wear it." Tsunade's tone softened with resignation. Her attempts to undermine Jingi had failed. Besides, the problem with Jingi was messy but manageable compared to what Sakumo had done. Too many girls were following Jingi around, yes, but refusing the daimyo's robe wasn't an option now. Sakumo had already put on his t-shirt. If Sakumo had refused, Jingi could have declined the robe without offense. Now, with Sakumo wearing his gift openly, Jingi's refusal would look like a deliberate snub. "Think about how the daimyo will take it," Tsunade said. "He gives you an honor and you don't wear it?" Sakumo wore his. If Jingi didn't, the daimyo would feel insulted. People would say Hyuga Jingi looked down on the daimyo's residence. Both garments had created a problem. Jingi might weather it, Sakumo would not. Hiruzen felt the loss of face keenly. "I gave it to you," he imagined the daimyo fuming. And you actually wore it. Tsunade left, defeated. She could try to smooth things over for Jingi, but Sakumo's actions were his own. Adults had to accept the consequences of their behavior. Not long after she was gone, Homura Mitokado arrived. His facial wounds had healed substantially after a few days. Hiruzen's office felt like a steam room from the pipe smoke. Hiruzen looked up at him without expression. "Homura, what do you think the daimyo's intention was?" he asked, letting the cigarette dangle. Homura shrugged. "Who knows? He could have meant it as a sincere honor, or as a veiled warning, or even as a way to win people over after something." Hiruzen stared into the smoke. "What did Tsunade say?" "She said Jingi doesn't care about the robe, he cares about women. You could argue it's harmless, but there are a lot of girls around the boy." Hiruzen's anger shifted. "Sakumo's behavior makes me angrier than Jingi. The daimyo gives him a Hokage t-shirt and he puts it on? I haven't stepped down yet. Are you already eyeing my seat?" He ground his teeth slightly at the thought. Homura's voice was cool. Is he truly oblivious, or is he interested in the position? Now that these clothes have been worn, we'll face more trouble. Homura's warning wasn't about Jingi. After what had happened recently, he had no stomach for moves against him. White Fang's reputation, Sakumo's, was considerable. Opposing him would be risky. Hiruzen's eye twitched. They had promoted Sakumo partly to blunt Jingi's rising prestige, but Sakumo had no sense of political subtlety. By donning the Hokage shirt, he'd sparked imagination and raised the succession question. Hiruzen had no desire to groom a successor. He was not ready to step down. Instead of solving their problem, Sakumo had handed the F4 faction more ammunition and made the whole situation far worse. After a long moment, the third Hokage lowered his voice. "Homura, I think we should talk to Tsunade and Jingi. If we're truly part of the Hokage faction, we can't stay split like this." You handle the discussion. I'll back you." If not for Sakumo Harake's blunder, the third Hokage never would have suggested peace talks. But someone who shouldn't have been in their circle had forced his way in. The Hokage faction needed to present a united front. Even if their old intimacy couldn't be fully restored, endless infighting would only hand others an opening. The final straw was the report that Sakumo had put on the Hokage garment and even celebrated at home. The news stiffened the third Hokage's resolve. "Cough! Cough! You mean the rewards the daimyo handed out to Sakumo-senpai and me were a Hokage robe, a Hokage shirt?" Jingi's incredulous voice cut in. "Sakumo-senpai actually put it on," Tsunade echoed, frustrated. "He let himself be dazzled by the honor. He not only wore it, he threw a celebration. The third Hokage is furious." "This is a problem," Jingi scowled. "Sakumo shouldn't be that clueless. What could he possibly be thinking? The daimyo gave it as an honor, and he went and wore it." Tsunade rubbed her temple. "It's not just the clothing," she said warily. "Sakumo-senpai seems to have gotten ideas about being a Hokage candidate." That was a different matter. A garment misstep could fade into a laugh, and in time, even the F4 would quietly accept it. But harboring ambitions? That struck at the third Hokage's deepest instincts. The old man clung to control. He wouldn't cultivate a successor and step aside. Sakumo's actions were a direct provocation. From now on, the third Hokage's greatest irritation might not be Hyuga Jingi, it might be Sakumo Hatake. Jingi sighed and signaled his little secretary to bring a cup of coffee. "What kind of useless robe is this? Do I have to wear it?" "Probably," Tsunade admitted, leaning back against the headboard and shooting a helpless look at the puppet standing by. "Sakumo-senpai has already worn part of it. Given my family connections with the daimyo's residence, even if I refused, you'd still be expected to wear it." Jingi went quiet. What kind of reward was this? He'd rather have something practical. In that instant, he envied Orochimaru. That man's reward had been plain and honest, stacks of silver and colorful bills. No ceremony, no spectacle. If Jingi could, he'd gladly trade the Hokage garment for cash. But once a reward left the daimyo's residence, it couldn't be exchanged. That would be disrespectful. Tsunade and the third Hokage would never let him sell it, even if he wanted to. "All right," he sighed. "It's just clothing. If I have to wear it, fine. But Sakumo-senpai's life won't be easy after this." "That's on him," Tsunade said. "He made the choice. By the way, the third Hokage wants to meet with the two of us." Sakumo's talk of being a Hokage candidate set him off. "Talk," Jingi said casually, settling the coffee on the table. Tell him plainly I don't want the job and I have no interest in it. Peace talks are fine, but they need to be worthwhile, compensation for our trouble. He didn't want to dive into the mess. Let Tsunade handle the third Hokage. As for Sakumo, Jingi felt only a cold sort of pity. He'd been warned to be careful, and yet as soon as the daimyo's envoy flattered him, he'd been swept away by honor. Power and prestige ensnared people until they couldn't tell themselves from the praise. Jingi finished his coffee and glanced at Ye Kang standing rigidly at his side. Out of curiosity, he asked a hypothetical. Ye Kang, suppose the Land of Wind's daimyo presented a Kazekage robe to a war hero from the Sand Village and suggested that person become a Kazekage candidate. Would the third Kazekage be furious? Ye Kang regarded him for a beat, then replied, probably not. The third Kazekage started grooming his successor a long time ago. That was true. The third Kazekage had been preparing Rasa, who shared the magnet release bloodline, early on. Ye Kang himself had once been a candidate. The third Kazekage had never given a firm stance on him, but the cultivation of a successor was open. That stood in sharp contrast to Konoha. The third Hokage's grip on power was almost pathological. He would never hand the reins to someone he hadn't chosen himself. Across the other villages, succession looked different. The third Kazekage was a model of deliberate preparation. In Iwagakure, Onoki was grooming his heir too, though choices were limited. In Kumogakure, the third Raikage had long favored his son. Kirigakure was chaotic. Mizukage's successions there had often been bought with corpses until Mei Terumi, whose family influence and personal strength let her ascend with less bloodshed. Konoha, however, the third Hokage's behavior made it plain. He wasn't about to cultivate a successor and step aside. Forget I asked, Jingi muttered. He'd slapped down the conversation before it could get awkward. Some topics were conversation killers, especially the delicate, peculiar ones about succession and honor. He decided it was better to let the third Hokage make his move and watch what happened next. The third Hokage was troubled, and the third Kazekage was no less so, though for different reasons. As the dust settled and news filtered through the shinobi world, the scale of the Sand Village's defeat stunned many. The Land of River's front had seemed relatively stable. Why had the Sand been routed so decisively and so messily, pushed back into the Land of Wind and turning what had been a full-scale war into a localized rout? Even a poor country didn't want a war breaking out on its own soil. The Land of Wind's daimyo had been in a foul temper ever since the reports arrived, cursing daily and personally, greeting Sand Village officials, singling out the third Kazekage in particular. The lay public saw only the curses. The professionals watched and analyzed. All of them kept circling back to one mystery: the puppets. The Sand's collapse had been precipitated by hundreds of mechanized attackers, and everyone wanted to know what sort of puppets could deal such a blow to a village famed for its puppet arts. Onoki, who had picked up scattered intelligence about the machines, felt that with Hyuga Jingi active, Konoha's threat level had jumped dramatically. Iwagakure had neglected the reports until the puppets actually appeared on the battlefield. Their first deployment had shocked the ninja world. Inside the Sand Village's new camp, the third Kazekage frowned as Chiyo returned. She'd only been home a few days before rushing back to the front with a proposal to share the Sand's puppet intelligence freely with Iwagakure, Kirigakure, and Kumogakure. The data had been costly to obtain. Surely it should be sold. The Kazekage hesitated. He had no objection to sharing intelligence, but traditionally it had a price. Lord Kazekage, Chiyo said, the village lost heavily because of these puppets. Other powers want this information. If we sell it, we get some compensation. She let the thought hang a moment. But giving it away will have a greater effect. The Kazekage raised an eyebrow. Why would we give it away for nothing if we can get payment? To create a threat theory about Konoha, Chiyo answered plainly. Once we show other villages how terrifying these puppets are, what will they think? They'll feel threatened, the Kazekage said after a moment. Exactly, Chiyo replied. Those puppets were used on the battlefield. If Konoha can deploy such weapons, could any of our villages withstand them? Smaller forces might not care, but the other great shinobi countries, Kumo, Iwa, Kiri, will. They'll realize Konoha can use these puppets not only against us, but against them, and that realization will force them to act. Even verbal support from several powers will put enormous pressure on Konoha. She added another point, and Hyuga Jingi himself is not to be underestimated. He bears the title God Slayer for a reason. If we publicly raise his danger level along with Konoha's, those villages will be even more inclined to side with us. When we hand over the intelligence, we can attach conditions, requests for cooperation or alliances. Under that pressure, I believe they'll agree. The third Kazekage considered it. The third Hokage wanted to launch a retaliatory strike on the sand, something that could escalate into a replicated, devastating offensive. The Kazekage feared that if the war reached a stalemate, Jingi's puppets might be airdropped into the sand's own territory. If those puppets could raise a well-defended camp, an airdrop would be catastrophic. If Konoha chose such escalation, the war would become unwinnable. Against that prospect, a few concessions were small. "All right," he said at last. "I accept your suggestion. I'll leave this matter to you. Don't disappoint me." "This old woman will not disappoint Lord Kazekage," Chiyo replied with quiet resolve. She already had a plan. As soon as she had the Kazekage's nod, she would take the sealing scroll containing the puppet intelligence and send envoys to Iwagakure, Kirigakure, and Kumagakure, not quietly, but in force. If they were going to make an impression, they might as well do it in a way that compelled response. Chiyo selected a delegation from the camp and dispatched them to the other villages to deliver the scroll and promote the threat narrative. Jingi had no idea that a campaign to isolate him in Konoha was about to unfold. At the same time, Jingi was preoccupied with other matters. An envoy from the Land of Wind's daimyo had arrived at the camp, and one of the first things the daimyo's representative asked about was the wounded. "Are there any injuries in the camp today that need surgery?" the envoy inquired. The assistant, surprised Jingi had asked first, hesitated. Yes, there are a few. But Lord Jingi, don't you want to receive the daimyo's envoy personally?" The injuries were not severe. The medical department could handle them without special intervention. Jingi had no obligation to get involved. "Welcome. What envoy group? Is the envoy group more important than our injured? Take me there. I'll start surgery immediately." "Welcome the envoy group? What a joke. Orochimaru can handle them." Jingi had no desire to meet the daimyo's residence envoy, not after the whole Sakumo Hatake incident. He had even less wish to be tied to those people. So he decided he would stay in the medical department's emergency room all day. Even if the daimyo himself showed up, Jingi wasn't going to be pulled away from work. He made his arrangements, sent a runner to inform Orochimaru, put on his white coat, and headed for the emergency room. Ye Kang, his temporary secretary, stood at the doorway, baffled and speechless. This was the daimyo's envoy. Why avoid them? Ye Kang didn't understand Jingi's refusal, but it didn't matter as long as Orochimaru did. When Orochimaru got the message, he understood immediately. Jingi didn't want an awkward social call. He didn't want to become a second Sakumo Hatake. So Orochimaru volunteered to meet the envoy and escort them to the command center. When the envoy asked about Jingi, Orochimaru explained smoothly. A local conflict broke out, and the fighting is fierce. A lot of wounded have been sent back from the forward camp. Jingi, our best medical ninja, is in the emergency room treating them. It was a perfect excuse. Even if the envoy didn't like it, they couldn't very well demand Jingi abandon injured soldiers to make a ceremony. The envoy group, unwilling to make a scene in a war zone, gave a polite exchange with Orochimaru, delivered the daimyo's greetings and gifts, left the rewards, and departed quickly. The front camp was close to the Land of Wind border. Staying there was dangerous. Envoy members had lives of comfort back home, no point risking assassination or ambush on a front line. They had been required to come only by order of the daimyo, otherwise none of them would have traveled so far. After seeing them off, Orochimaru carried the gifts to the medical department. Jingi had already gone back to his quarters and was sitting cross-legged in a chair, reading. Orochimaru raised an eyebrow. "I thought you'd be in the emergency room longer," he said. "There weren't that many wounded, and the others can manage. Why would I camp there all day?" Jingi shot him a look that plainly said, "Don't be ridiculous." Since the conflict had become localized rather than full-scale, casualties had dropped. A localized war didn't require the full deployment of forces. Contact and combat were already decreasing, so there were fewer injured to treat. Orochimaru handed over the package. Here, good quality, nice style, you'll look handsome in it. Jingi glanced at the robe, white with red flame patterns along the hem, clearly top-grade material. The daimyo had thought about it. Jingi, however, wasn't thrilled. How about we swap, he said, half joking. Orochimaru smiled without answering. A Hokage robe is a Hokage robe. It's better than a paper reward. Jingi couldn't bargain him down, so he put the robe on. It did look good, much better than any Hokage t-shirt. No wonder Sakumo Hake had only gotten a t-shirt. No matter his merits, they didn't measure up to Jingi's. The F4 could try to downplay Jingi's achievements, but the daimyo had not. That was why Jingi got a proper robe and Sakumo only a shirt. There was only one robe, after all. If it got stained or ruined, you'd have to reorder it. At least the back didn't bear the big kanji, 4th Hokage, which would have made it look exactly like little yellow hairs. Orochimaru looked over the robe once, then shrugged. Hokage robes were hardly interesting compared to a set of glass test tubes. By the way, the experimental subjects are ready, he said, producing a sealing scroll. They've got big appetites, so keeping them will cost. But with your skills, raising these summoning beasts shouldn't be a problem. He opened the scroll and 2 small snakes, one gold, one black, slithered out and dropped into Jingi's hands. Jingi stared. Only Orochimaru would seal summoning beasts in a scroll like groceries and not worry about suffocating them. Jingi set out a proper box and placed the snakes inside, trying to keep his expression neutral. "What about your own?" he asked. "The others died. On the operating table," Orochimaru said casually. "I don't need more. Manda's good enough, aside from his personality." Jingi went very quiet. Orochimaru's experiments had been expensive. Tens of millions of ryo poured into research. Yet Orochimaru had no patience for a money pit when the results were what mattered. If the subjects died during experimentation, so be it. Money meant little compared to data. The thought of those living creatures being killed for the sake of research made Jingi wince. After Orochimaru left, Jingi noticed Ye Kang still by the box, watching the little snakes with wide eyes. "What? Interested?" he asked. "No." Ye Kang shook her head. "I'm just curious. Besides, I can't afford a summoning beast that eats like that." Jingi glanced at her and gave a wry assessment. Then he looked down at the 2 little snakes in the box and couldn't help wondering whether Minato's frog would be bankrupted if he had to feed these things. "Oh, right." Orochimaru returned at that moment and offered a word of warning. "Those experimental subjects can only be kept within the ninja world. Don't try to put them back in places like Ryuchi Cave. They'll become lunch for other summoning beasts." He wasn't speaking on a whim. Orochimaru had tested it. Manda, in particular, had a taste for the kinds of creatures he bought for experiments. Jingi nodded, brow tightening. "So that's why your experimental subjects died on the operating table. You never meant to raise them, did you?" Orochimaru gave a small, amused smile. "Perhaps." He shrugged and left, leaving Jingi staring at the box. Within half an hour, the snakes were moving, slithering slowly as if searching. They were clearly hungry. Jingi sighed. 10 minutes later, 2 Anbu puppets returned, carrying a large wild boar. The butchering was left to Ye Kang. After all, that was what secretaries were for. Strips of meat were tossed into the box, and the little snakes devoured them hungrily. It was almost unbelievable that creatures only as thick as a thumb and about a meter long could swallow meat heavier than their own bodies. Less than 3 hours later, they were asking for more. The next morning, Ye Kang, now in charge of feeding, reported to Jingi, "They need to be fed about every 3 hours. Their digestion is extremely fast. They can swallow bones and digest them fully, and they grow very quickly." In just one afternoon and night, the pair had eaten a third of a boar. They had already grown longer and thicker. Jingi picked up the golden-scaled snake and signed a summoning contract. As the contract sealed, the snake coiled around his arm, and through the bond it sent constant, insistent signals of hunger. "Keep feeding them. Have the puppets bring back more prey," Jingi said. Hunting was a job for puppets. There was no reason to bother the village shinobi. 3 days later, The snakes were as thick as an arm and nearly 3 meters long. Jinji finally understood Orochimaru's warning. These experimental subjects were insatiable, and they grew at an alarming rate. He called Tsunade and told her to have Minato pack up and come to the forward camp under puppet escort. If Minato was going to have a summoning beast, he should raise it himself, and signing the contract early would help build the bond. Ah! Why don't I have one? Nawaki burst out, outraged. Minato gave an embarrassed, polite smile and didn't know what to say to comfort him. Tsunade's reply was blunt. Because these were made by Minato's teacher. Your teacher, who knows where he is wandering? Her words hit Nawaki hard. Fortunately, it was mostly teasing. Tsunade would not let Jiraiya off the hook if he came back without getting something suitable for Nawaki. Enough. When Jiraiya returns, I'll have him take you to Mount Myoboku to make a contract with the Toads. If you ever qualify for Sage Mode, that's the place to go. She aimed to shut Nawaki up and give him hope at the same time. His lack of a summoning beast was only temporary. Patting her sulking brother, Tsunade scolded, "Do you think signing contracts is some kind of game? The snakes Jingi has were made in Orochimaru's lab. Their stomachs are bottomless. If I gave one to you, you couldn't afford to keep it." Lady Tsunade, Minato raised a tentative hand. Are the summoning beasts my teacher made really that hungry? Tsunade looked at Minato with sympathy and shook her head. If Jingi is right, yes, for a long time you'll be running around to feed them. Do your best. If you really can't manage, go to your teacher. After all, he made them. If you can't afford to feed them, he'll have to take responsibility. There wasn't much else she could advise. Minato was still young. Where would he find the money and resources to raise a creature with an appetite like that? I'll work hard to hunt and earn the money, he said, determined. If worst came to worst, he'd ask his teacher for help. So Minato packed, said a reluctant goodbye to Nawaki, and left under puppet escort for the forward camp. Nawaki watched him go from the village gate and scowled at his sister. Why can Minato go to the forward camp and I can't? Idiot, because your taijutsu is rubbish. For now, I'm going to be your taijutsu teacher. Tsunade grinned, reached out, and punched him lightly. Nawaki's training plan, set up with Jingi's guidance, had indeed prioritized ninjutsu at first, especially water release techniques. Minato, by contrast, had focused on taijutsu and reflexes. Ninjutsu and sealing techniques would be added later. But you and Jingi made me do ninjutsu all the time, Nawaki protested, indignation flaring. Tsunade punched him again. That's because we want you to master compressed water release first. Taijutsu and the rest you can make up for later. Water release is what you must focus on. If Nawaki could master Senju Tobirama's water release, he'd be on his way to becoming one of the ninja world's heavyweights. By the same logic, Minato Namikaze, if he learned Senju Tobirama's Flying Thunder God technique, could also rise to that level. That was how formidable Tobirama's legacy was. If it weren't for two prodigies overshadowing him, his reputation would be even greater. 2 days later, Minato Namikaze arrived at the frontline camp and stood before Jingi. Seeing the two huge snakes coiled in the room, Little Yellow Hair blinked, a little stunned. Teacher, didn't you say they were very small? Jingi rubbed his forehead. He had a headache brewing. I wasn't wrong. A few days ago, they really were tiny, just a bit thicker than a finger. Who would believe two snakes could balloon to the thickness of a calf and almost 5 meters long in just a few days? If Jingi hadn't watched them grow with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed it. What kind of creatures had Orochimaru created? Let's not talk about that now. Sign the contract first, Jingi said. The black one, you'll hunt with it every day, with the puppet at your side. Then you'll train after you return. It was hardly realistic to expect Little Yellow Hair to handle raising a summoned beast, but Jingi wanted him to feel the strain and responsibility that came with it. Yes, teacher, Minato answered obediently, doing as instructed without a second thought. So different from Nawaki, who, despite being as solid as 100 jin, seemed to have 98 jin of rebelliousness. Oh, and this is Ye Kang, Jingi added. She transferred from the Sand Ninja Village and possesses the Scorch bloodline limit. Her strength is barely average, and she'll be your sparring partner from now on. Ye Kang went quiet. Barely average? She bristled at the understatement. Minato blinked. He hadn't seen her before and wondered how she had appeared beside his teacher. Transferred from the sand? Jingi interrupted Minato's speculation with a pat to his head. She was captured by me on the battlefield, he said. She turned over a new leaf and joined our side. Only after Minato left to hunt with the puppet did Ye Kang speak up. Is this your disciple? He looks ordinary, not even as good as Rasa. Ye Kang had once viewed Rasa as a rival, but she never liked him personally. His heart was too dark. As for Minato, had he been a bloodline user, Ye Kang might have respected him more, but apart from his bright smile, she saw nothing remarkable. Rasa? Jingyi was stunned. Did I hear you correctly? Ye Kang didn't think she'd said anything wrong. Jingyi's expression turned strange. Is it possible the Rasa you're talking about is only so-so? Not as good as Rasa? Jingyi found the idea laughable. Early on, Rasa's bloodline had given him a powerful edge. Minato had been steady but not spectacular. But once Minato mastered sealing techniques and the flying thunder god, who knew? He might soar past Rasa. Perhaps, Jingyi said vaguely. They would see in time. It was pointless to boast now. I hope you keep your eyes open and don't regret this remark later. Minato successfully sealed a contract with the Black Snake, and the beast began to demonstrate what bottomless appetite and rapid growth meant. The two snakes ate like monsters, far more than pigs, and they grew much faster, strength rising quickly as they did. It was exhausting for little Yellow Hair, who had to accompany the puppet into the forest each day to hunt for prey to feed them. Fortunately, the ninja world's forests were rife with game, including many large animals. As the snakes continued to swell, Jingyi had no choice but to keep them in the woods outside the camp, guarded by puppets to keep people away and to prevent the summons from roaming free. At their current rate, Jingyi thought, they might rival Manda in about 3 years, roughly the window of Minato's peak growth. It was possible that both ninja and summoned beast would make a name for themselves then. In a valley in the land of grass, near the border with the land of earth, Chiyo arrived with a retinue. Every invited guest was already present, and the air was thick with tension. The third Mizukage stood apart, watching the commotion as if it meant nothing to him. Onoki and the third Raikage glared at one another, each clearly displeased. In recent years, Iwagakure and Kumogakure had clashed often, and Kumogakure and Kirigakure had their disputes over the seas. In Onoki's view, the people of the Land of Lightning stirred up trouble wherever they went. The third Mizukage had no desire to vie with the third Raikage. Such things were pointless. No sooner had Chiyo entered than Onoki snapped, sarcasm dripping from his voice. Chiyo, you sent word to notify us, but you were the last to arrive. San's sincerity is abundant. Perhaps they've been beaten so thoroughly by Konoha they can't lift their heads, the third Raikage added calmly. Chiyo felt her blood boil. Two shameless old men, weren't they supposed to be at odds with each other? Why did they immediately band together to target an old grandmother like her? The representatives of the 4 villages had gathered, and by sheer coincidence, all 4 envoys were old men. Only the third Mizukage looked a little younger, roughly the same age as the third Kazekage. Chiyo, Onoki, and the third Raikage could only be described as ancient. Chiyo regarded Onoki and the Raikage with a flat stare. If you two enjoy mocking the Sand Village so much, carry on, she said. Faced with Onoki and the Raikage's derision, Chiyo had no real comeback. Their standing outmatched hers, and, more importantly, the Sand Village had come asking a favor. She could not afford to be stubborn in front of them. We were invited here for a reason, she added. This isn't a meeting to jeer at us. To keep Chiyo from storming off in anger, the third Mizukage stepped forward and offered a neutral word. Sand had indeed been dealt a bad hand, he said, but now was not the time for jokes. Securing useful information was more important than scoring cheap points. Once he intervened, Onoki and the Raikage quieted down. Chiyo, the third Mizukage went on, you summoned us here. Speak plainly. I imagine Sand doesn't have time to waste on courtesies. Behind the politeness, his tone was a thinly veiled warning. Be sincere, or there would be consequences. The third Mizukage was not as soft as he sounded. His cruelty had fallen hardest on his own people, and many in the mist had paid with their lives under his rule. Even their young ruler Yagura had inherited that same iron hand, leaving the village fearful. Chiyo did not let the moment pass without clarifying her intent. The village means to share some information with you, all of it, and for free. She spoke that last line pointedly to cut off Onoki's sarcasm. Among the three, Onoki had been the most openly contemptuous of the sand. Chiyo produced 4 sealed scrolls and handed one to each of the other 3 leaders. The trio exchanged looks and, with unanimous agreement, opened theirs immediately. They read. Onoki's eyebrows shot up. He could hardly believe that Chiyo would hand over something so sensitive without charge. The third Raikage's face tightened more subtly. The third Mizukage remained the calmest, apparently reassured that the water country lay out at sea and was unlikely to be hit by the same threat unless it engaged Konoha directly. Still, the information demanded attention. After scanning the pages, Onoki sighed. No wonder you fell so quickly. Your camp was hit, your losses were heavy, morale collapsed, and the front took it all. Retreat was the only option. He stared at Chiyo. But I'm curious, why didn't you take Hyuga Jingi's puppets seriously sooner? Why did you suffer such a disastrous loss? Kitsuchi had shared some intelligence with the sand about these puppets, Onoki said, and yet the sand seemed not to have acted on it. The implications stung. Take it seriously. How would you have us take it seriously? Chiyo snapped. She was in no mood to be patronized. Sand Village is defined by its puppets. If word got out that there were puppets that could neutralize ours, how would that affect the confidence of our puppet corps? She made her point bluntly. Jingi's creations were a crippling, asymmetrical threat to the Sand's puppeteers. If the existence and nature of those puppets were revealed, the first to falter would be the Sand's own puppet teams. If your fighters don't believe in their own tools, what use is resistance? Better to keep that knowledge contained than to spread panic. Onoki pressed with a question that mattered to all three. Can you guarantee the scroll's contents are accurate? That Konoha's puppets operate exactly as described? Absolutely, Chiyo said. I stake the village's honor on it. The Tsuchikage can confirm. She jerked her head toward Onoki. The older man nodded gravely. She's right, he said. These puppets are from a Konoha ninja named Hyuga Jingi. They are unlike anything we've seen. Autonomous, able to act without a puppeteer at the controls. They move and fight as if alive, and they're powerful. We ran into them on the Rain Country battlefield. They're not only tough, Chiyo added, clenching her teeth at the memory. They can self-destruct. Even if you cut them apart, they detonate. The explosions are tremendous. The third Mizukage summarized quietly, so encountering them without prior knowledge would lead to catastrophic losses. Yes, Onoki agreed. Chiyo's face twisted with hatred as she remembered the attack on their camp. Those damned puppets don't behave like normal enemies. They don't even try to duel. The moment they see people, they choose to blow themselves up. As a surprise weapon, they're terrifying. A camp of 1,000 shinobi was shredded by a few hundred puppets. Casualties were innumerable, and they can be delivered from the air. Imagine that, airdropped into a village. Even a fortified camp wouldn't hold. If those puppets were scattered over a settlement, the devastation would be unimaginable. The third Raikage, who had been skeptical at first, grew serious. Chiyo's account left no room for doubt. Any village could be ruined if dozens or hundreds of such explosives were unleashed among civilians and structures. They didn't need to chase down targets. They would simply detonate everywhere. And what's more despicable, Chiyo said, voice low, is that these puppets are made from human corpses, corpses of shinobi, even from our own and from Iwagakure. Onoki swore at the revelation. Damn them, using the bodies of the dead to fashion these things. Then, after a beat, he turned his ire back on Chiyo with a sharp little smile. But don't look so self-righteous, Sand Village. You use enemy corpses for your puppets too. Chiyo, unjustly berated, shot a glare up at Onoki. Ever since the villages pressured us, the Sand has cut back sharply on using corpses as puppet parts. We mostly use manufactured components now. What I'm trying to make you see isn't the materials, she continued. It's the threat. If none of you are worried that one day these puppets might be used against your village, then you may as well pretend I never came. No one wanted that to happen. But they were not fools. They would not act for the Sand without a full picture. The third Raikage stood with his arms folded, looking down at the much smaller Chiyo. We understand your motive, he said. You want us united so we can put pressure on Konoha. Between us, if any village is likely to be attacked by Konoha's puppets, it's the sand. Yes, that was my aim, Chiyo admitted. But can you deny how destructive those puppets are? Can you guarantee you'll never have a conflict with Konoha in the future? She asked. If war breaks out, there will come a day when those puppets fall from the sky. Even a small clash could bring that down on you. So what do you want us to do? The third Mizukage asked bluntly. Enough talk of puppets. Say plainly why the sand sought them out. We should unite and exert pressure. Chiyo gripped her fists until her knuckles whitened. Call a 5 Kage summit, she said through gritted teeth. Make this an agenda item. Formally prohibit Konoha from using that kind of power in war, and especially forbid them from airdropping puppets into villages. She spread a map on the table. This records several oases and settlements in the Land of Wind. They were wiped out in 2 or 3 hours. Completely wiped out. The ground at the sites collapsed into huge sinkholes. What kind of force do you think could do that? There was more? The puppet issue alone would be a lot to handle, and now Chiyo raised something else. Is Konoha really that dangerous? The 3 Kage exchanged uncertain looks. We investigated, Chiyo went on. The destruction was the result of a single strike, not multiple attacks. We can't even figure out what sort of force could cause this. Frankly, she added, not even a rampage by a village's tailed beast, its Biju Dama, caused damage this catastrophic. And it might have been caused by one of those puppets. Whether it was true or not, Chiyo had to connect these things to make the other villages take her seriously. The thought of puppet as weapons was already terrifying. Compounded with a strike capable of leaving cratered wastelands, it would force the cloud, stone, and mist to react. Could a single attack be more destructive than a tailed beast ball? It sounded impossible, but Chiyo didn't seem to be exaggerating. If you don't believe us, send investigators into the Land of Wind, she said. The Sand Village won't stop anyone you send. That sealed it. If she welcomed inspection, the claim could be true. The puppet threat could be discussed and mitigated later, but an attack on the scale of a Biju Dama was beyond a joke. Even the biggest shinobi cities couldn't withstand many such assaults. The consequences for any village struck would dwarf the puppet problem. So a 5 Kage summit. Then, Onoki didn't like making things more complicated than necessary. The third Mizukage agreed coldly. If there isn't a summit, how can we jointly limit them? Simple warnings won't work. Only a united front will force Konoha to heed us. If 4 of the 5 great nations united, Konoha would have to take the issue seriously. Where will it be held? The third Raikage asked. Onoki already knew the Raikage's concern and answered quickly. The Land of Iron. It must be in a neutral place. Put the summit in the Cloud Village? Not a chance. Only the neutral Land of Iron would do. Everyone would bring their guards, no exceptions. I agree, the third Mizukage said at once. The summit could happen, but the site must be neutral. The Raikage glowered at Onoki with obvious resentment, and Onoki shot the same look back. No one backed down. Then it's the Land of Iron, the Raikage conceded begrudgingly. Our Kazekage will be there on time. As for the date, Chiyo paused, then declared, 10 days from now. 10 days. The third Raikage scowled, but had to accept it. With the summit set and her objective achieved, Chiyo felt some relief. She took her leave of Onoki, the Raikage, and the Mizukage, and returned swiftly to the Land of Wind. Notifying Konoha, however, was delicate. If sand envoys went directly to the third Hokage, they might be intercepted and questioned. The sand feared Konoha. The cloud did not. So the Raikage agreed to send the invitation to Konoha himself, using the Cloud Village as intermediary. The sand had announced the need for a summit, but the cloud and stone would carry the burden of pressing the matter. Without the Raikage and Onoki behind it, Konoha would ignore the sand. When the third Hokage received an invitation from the Raikage's office, he was baffled. A 5 Kage summit at this moment? Had something major occurred across the shinobi world that required all 5 leaders? He had not heard a rumor, yet the invitation had arrived. Are you certain the sender really is from the Cloud Village? He asked the Hokage guard platoon. Yes, Hokage-sama, they answered. We verified the sender as being from the Raikage's office. Would you like to see him? Whether to receive envoys was the third Hokage's prerogative. He decided to speak with the messenger. When the Cloud Village envoy entered the Hokage office, the third Hokage looked him over and asked plainly, "From what I understand, nothing has happened lately that would require a five Kage summit. Why has the Cloud Village invited Konoha?" The envoy bowed stiffly. "Did your village propose the five Kage summit?"